Welcome, everyone. We're really glad to see so many people joining us. We're just going to give folks another minute or so to join and figure out the tech to get online, and then we will get started. It would be great if people could introduce themselves in the chat so we can hear about where everybody's joining from. Okay, and as we have people joining, I'm going to start opening up the space. So hello, everyone. Good morning, and it's midday for some of you, and good afternoon and good evening to others. It's really great to have you here. My name is Anik, and I'm a technical specialist at SPRI. Many of you will know that we have a long history of addressing vicarious trauma, stress, and burnout in the field and promoting self-care. Currently, our journey is taking us deeper in collective care approaches, and we want to contribute to the field with wellness and self and collective care concepts and practices that are accessible, available, and meaningful in diverse contexts that people can own and define for themselves and with others they work and live with. As you may also know, we are committed to challenging hierarchies of knowledge and decolonizing knowledge and knowledge building in different ways. And today's event is an intersection of these two priorities that we have. We are hoping that today's discussion is going to help to shift thinking away from the dominant Western individual therapy models and explore different localized approaches and practices around self and collective care, particularly at the organizational level. We really want to spend some time questioning and critically reflecting on assumptions about what care is, bearing in mind that it can mean and be put into action very differently for different groups and different individuals. We have some really exciting people to contribute to the discussion today, not least of which is all of you, our participants. And I'm really excited about today's discussion. And just to let you all know, we are going to be recording this webinar so that we can share it with the broader network via our website. And with that, I will hand over to Aisha. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anik. And hi, everyone. I'm Aisha, and I'm a technical specialist with SPRI based out of Cape Town right now. And I'm going to, jump right in by introducing you to our amazing panelists. I'm really excited about the discussion today. So we have three great panelists with us. I'll start with Vani Vishwanathan. She is a senior program officer at Tarshi, which is an NGO based in New Delhi, India, which works on sexuality and well-being. Vani works on bringing rights-based information and perspectives on sexuality to diverse people. And this includes the right to self-care and collective care to all, especially those working on sexuality issues or who are marginalized due to their sexuality. Vani and her colleagues recently developed an online course on stress management and burnout prevention, especially for people who do people work. The course is called Reflect, Realign, and Renew, and it's available on tarshi.net. And Vani, please feel free to pop we'll pop the link into the chat box so that people can see that. Sharanya Sekaram is an independent policy and advocacy consultant in gender. She's based out of Colombo, Sri Lanka. She's currently focused on gender-based violence, resourcing women and girl-led organizations, and violence against women and girls in humanitarian and emergency contexts. Sharanya is also currently reading for a postgraduate diploma leading to a master's in women and gender studies at the University of Colombo. She is passionate about the democratization of information and resources, as well as access to networks and spaces, and is currently working with the Coalition of Feminists for Social Change as their advocacy consultant and with Voice as their global women's movement lead. She's also co-founded a feminist collective called Every Story based in Sri Lanka. Dr. Carol Labour is the Presidential Advisor on Mental Health of Sierra Leone, West Africa, and has over 31 years of collective experience, including 14 years in gender-focused education, mental health, and psychosocial support services in Sierra Leone. Charged with designing and developing the framework for scaling up the quality and availability of mental health and addiction service delivery for over 7 million people. She's an advocate, speaker, facilitator, and researcher, and her work is grounded at the intersectionality of race, gender, and disparities in mental health trauma and sexual and gender-based violence services. Her work has a global reach aimed at maximizing well-being with experience in creating and co-creating individual and collective organizational wellness spaces in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, England, and the United States. So with that, I'm gonna start this session. I think you can see we've got 3 great panelists and we're excited to hear from them. And before I actually hand over and start asking them questions, we'd like to hear from you, our audience, and we'd like to do this via the Mentimeter, that the link of which is going to be in the chat box right now. And what we would like to ask you is, in one word or in a few words, a phrase, can you please tell us, what does decolonizing wellness and self-care mean to you personally? In any way, in your personal life, in your professional life, what do these words mean to you? And if you wouldn't mind clicking on the Mentimeter link and just popping something in there, we'll just wait for a couple of minutes and then we'll pull that up and see what comes up. Thank you. And that goes for the panelists as well, please. Can everybody pop something into the Mentimeter link? I'm just going to leave it for another 30 seconds and then we'll look at it. I hope all of you are able to click on that link. Okay, hopefully everyone's had a chance to do that now. Moma, can I ask you please to launch that Mentimeter screen so we can just look at some of the things that have started coming up? Okay, it's quite small, but let me see what I can read. So diversity in wellness, oh, thank you. Care in a community context, prioritizing personhood, there's intersectional analysis, there's flourishing, resilience, community-based self-healing, community-based, there's internal resonance, structural wellness, not othering self-care, there's care done in a group. People are talking about honoring traditions, not just for the privileged, resistance to racism, and no societal expectations. So these are some of the things that are coming up that are really interesting. And I think looking at those, I mean, I think we've got loads of stuff to already start sort of talking about things. So I think to get going, I'd like to ask our panel, do you have any reflections on these responses and anything you would like to add or emphasize from your experience, or anything that particularly resonates for you in the stuff that's coming up on that screen? And Moma, you can stop sharing the screen. Thank you. Oh no, actually you can't. Sorry, in case the panelists need to look at that. And yeah, sorry about that. So keep the screen sharing on for now. Thank you. So yeah, anyone who wants to jump in, please jump in now.
I can jump in and say that it's the emphasis on community and collective, and the fact that very explicitly people have said not individualistic, when so much, sort of colonized framing of self-care, it's framed as an individual act, it's framed as something that you do for yourself, and it's very individualistic. And it's really interesting to see the amount of community, the focus on community, the collective, the group. That's really interesting to me, how much that's coming out so strongly, which is understanding we don't function in silos, which is so interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments on this, Vani or Carol?
Yes, thank you for that. I would say that personalization resonates with me, because when we talk about self and collective care, it has to start with ourselves and how we're showing up within the communities, our homes, and organizations that we're associated with.
Absolutely. So, okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for that. And thank you to our audience for putting all of those very interesting things in there. And Vani, I know that through your work at Tarshi, you've been, engaging people who do people work to explore wellness and self-care. So, like, thinking about some of these things that are coming up, what have the reactions been to this?
Thanks, Aisha, and hello, everyone. So to start out, I want to just explore the phrase people who do people work. Just very quickly, we use people work to refer to any kind of helping professions, anything that involves working with people's lives, their human rights, and it could be anything from health services to counseling to being a teacher, and so many diverse professions, especially in the development sector. And that is a sector that we know where enough conversations on self-care and collective care and well-being are not happening. Or, well, even when they happen, in the trainings and sessions that we have done on stress management and burnout prevention with folks who do people work, one of the first things that we really struggle with is to get them to look at the idea of self-care without dismissing it as, spa days and bubble baths. Bubble baths have no meaning in countries like India. No, we take showers with like buckets and mugs, So, but there is this connotation that has just seeped in over the last few years that is very difficult to, it takes us a fair bit of work to sort of expand people's idea of what we mean by self-care, or what self-care should actually get to mean. Because like it has come up in the Mentimeter poll as well, one is it's seen as Western, there's a strong capitalistic sort of association with it. Self-care is used to sell everything from spa sessions, of course, but shopping or binge watching on, OTT web platforms. So all of which entail some amount of spending. There is co-option by a lot of corporates. And so understandably, there's quite a bit of resistance to the idea of self-care, and therefore, as an extension, well-being as well. And like Sharanya also, mentioned, what the Menti poll shows is that self-care or wellness has come to be seen as an individual responsibility. And that's something that, through our course, through our work over the years, we've come to understand that who we are as individuals give us very unique causes of stress. My identity as my gender identity, the work that I do, my caste location when it comes to South Asian context, all of these give me very unique aspects that could cause stress. So if stress comes from everything that is, stress is not just because of who I am as an individual. It depends on the institution or say organization that I'm a part of. It depends on the systemic factors, such as all of these that I brought in, the work that I do, my disability status, my mental health status. So if all of these factors cause stress, how can wellness just depend on the individual? So a very individual approach to self-care isn't going to work. And that's one of the first things that we hear from people we interact with. So who gets left out in these conversations? Those who are marginalized due to various identities, especially when it comes to, say, counselors working on gender-based violence. They have to contend with issues like working on a difficult topic, which is societally not really seen as, it's seen as a private matter that a counselor shouldn't interfere in. At the individual level, there's probably family resistance to the kind of work that I might do as a counselor. So there's multiple factors that cause this kind of stress. So, and if you do people work, there's also this whole thing of why do you want to bother about well-being? I mean, you've dedicated your life to a cause. So, put yourself aside and focus on helping out the people that you sort of signed up for. So that's another issue that we have to contend with. And of course, like many Asian contexts are very collective, so while of course families and collectives and neighborhoods are also sources of stress, we know that over the years, it's a cultural thing that they're also very strong sources of well-being. There is a big sense of collective care that comes from these very community setups, but a very colonial approach to self-care and well-being does not take this localization into account. It doesn't take collective care into account. So I've seen that even things like religion or spirituality, while of course they may have patriarchal connotations, they may have casteist, classist connotations, decolonizing it to me means that we have to take a nuanced approach to these very institutions. We cannot just paint them as irrelevant, that it cannot work for these communities. We need to move these discussions forward. So that's one more thing. And just one last point about how, Western notions of productivity and tracking have crept into self-care as well. So we have wonderful apps and, for meditation, for habit tracking and so on, but it has almost come to mean that if you cannot measure it, it's not meaningful. So it's come to the place that even self-care and wellness have to follow a certain pattern. You have to be productive and have to do lists with even your self-care concepts. So it is a slightly, a global north way of tracking and measuring and productivity. And all of these we need to be questioned. And those are some of the things we've learned from our interactions here.
Okay, thank you. Wow, a lot there. And, some things that really resonate around definitions and inclusiveness and context and cultures of martyrdom around the sort of work we all do. And there's so much there in what you've said, Vani. I'd just like to quickly ask, would either of the other panelists like to comment or pick up on anything that Vani has mentioned before I move on? No? Okay, so then great. I'm going to move on from that. So I would actually, we'd also love to hear what the audience thinks about this. So one of the questions we wanted to look at are sort of what examples have different people, our panelists and our audience seen on decolonizing wellness and self-care in action. So are there examples like that you've come across in your own work that have meant something to you, that have resonated to you? And if so, it would be really amazing if you could pop it in the chat box, and then we'll look at it and sort of continue the discussion. But I just love to ask you to share that. And then talking about this, what examples have we seen of decolonizing wellness and self-care? Carol, can I ask you to jump in here and comment from your experience on this, or on anything that comes up in the chat box as it comes up?
Sure. Thank you, Aisha, and good morning, everyone. For me, with decolonizing wellness and self-care, in my experience, what has happened within some organizations in Sierra Leone, from a low to middle income country standpoint, is really bringing in individuals into the fold, into the organizations to have discussions, first with what's needed, because we like to look at self-care with one brush, and it's not a one size fits all. You have individuals that are in organizations that are dealing with personal issues, individuals that are dealing with domestic violence, sexual violence. We do this work, but some of us are also survivors as well. You have individuals that are dealing with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, neurological issues as well. And so one of the things that we should work towards in decolonizing wellness and self-care is, what does it look like for the individual? I know Vani said, yes, it's a collective, because we all show up in our places of work, within our communities, and even with our families, but we show up with our its, and our its is our interpersonal traumas. And so how do we deal with that? It's not just about, like Vani said, taking a bubble bath. Yeah, in Sierra Leone, we have buckets. We have the buckets and the mugs. Yeah. And if you can afford to go for a weekend out, that's fine. But when you come back, you're still, whatever you're dealing with is still there. You can take as many showers as you want. You can have as many girlfriend nights as you want, lunch dates as you want, but your it is still there. And it impacts how you're showing up. And so decolonizing it, what I've seen examples, again, in Sierra Leone, is bringing in an external person or organization, such as Tarshi, bringing them in so that they're separate from the organization, to building that trust within employees, staff, so that there's room for individual discussions, space for individuals discussions, space for group discussions as well, and what's happening. But then also skills building, because oftentimes when we talk about wellness and self-care, the individuals that are causing our stress and our anxiety, they don't know that. They don't see anything wrong with their behaviors at times. And so it's really about group discussions, group skills building, even in terms of conflict resolution, constructive feedback, because some of us may be sensitive to feedback. Some of us may be very emotional based on our upbringing, because when we talk about mental health, it has to do with our genetics. Are we predisposed? Do we know, or have we learned how to manage our stress as individuals before we come into an organization? And so the examples that I've seen just in Sierra Leone is really doing a lot of skills building, but then on a larger scale, some global examples is really providing individuals with radical rest, time for rest away from the office, boundaries, time and boundaries. If you're in an organization and there's a lot of pressure to perform, how do you manage expectations? How do you manage productivity with the individual self-care and the wellness of the individuals? And lastly, if there's a budget for individuals to go external for self-care, for the care that they need. Because in order to really practice self-care, you have to know what it is and what it means to you. What does it look like to you? What do you need? Are there childhood wounds that need to be healed, that you're transferring now into adulthood, that you're taking into the workplace? Are there DV issues that haven't been addressed? Are there budgetary, financial issues that you're dealing with at home, and now you're showing up in the workplace with a smile? And so unpacking the issues, the environmental factors that are affecting our mental health and wellness is a prime example in decolonizing wellness and self-care. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Carol. And that's really very interesting, everything you've said. And some of our participants have also made some comments. So, for instance, in the chat box, we have self-care, wellness in the African space is sometimes viewed as selfish. So I think this also goes back to what Vani was saying. who's for the African woman who's supposed to be always present, always having it together and showing up. It's been great to see women coming together and embracing the need for self-care. And where I've seen it most is the creation of online communities, encouraging self-care in various forms, even something as simple as time away from stressors. So that's a really interesting example. And also the point again has been made around, you know, that it's good for those who have the time and who can afford. Of course, we go back to the point around budgets and what the financial stresses are in your life. There's also another great example on conscious approaches to understanding time cultures, polychronic versus monochronic, and unpacking our understanding around the dominant time cultures. And an example here around collective solidarity and peer spaces to share grief and stress happening due to different things, including the pandemic, which have helped people to cultivate a sense of compassion and empathy. So these are all really, really interesting. Radical rest has come up again. The nap ministry, that's fantastic. I love the idea of a nap ministry. And one last one, a person who's in service delivery with NGOs receives burnout if the organization is lacking in systems and having a toxic environment. Absolutely, the organization culture is very important. So all these are, you know, great points. And again, you know, let me turn it back to our panelists. Is there anything in this, any of these examples that resonate, anything you'd like to comment on? Sharanya, is there any aspect of this that you'd like to comment on and what you're seeing in Sri Lanka?
I mean, I thank you both, Carol and Vani, who just sort of set the stage so beautifully. I think two key things that are rising out from what the chat is saying and what our previous panelists have been saying. The first is how the idea of self-care is couched in a denial of pleasure. For me, that is something I have been unpacking and kind of thinking about for so long. In understanding that we always come from a point of scarcity and hardly ever a point of abundance. And so pleasure is seen as something that has to be earned. It's not seen as an inherent right. It's not seen as something that we should just have in our lives. So even when we talk about self-care, we talk about having to access self-care after you've burnt out, or when you are tired, or when things get too much. Yeah. There is a very little sense that you can access self-care, or you have a right to self-care as an inherent regular part of your existence. It always has to come after the fact that when you need it. And it's a response, right? Not a general sense of being. The second thing that comes to me when I think about, especially in the idea of decolonizing is, and I'm thinking about this, you can't see me, but as I sit a lot with my legs crossed, because it works better for my back. Also because as a South Asian, I know that this is, in yoga and Vedic postures and all of these things, we're told that these are great positions. But in a very colonized world, I have been taught that this is an unprofessional way of sitting. That this is sort of the way I can sit at home on my couch, but when I'm seated in like a work environment, it is unprofessional. And to me, this is one example of how colonization and where we need to think about decolonizing our approaches to self-care is because so much of what has been inherently embedded in our cultures and our ways of being, and I was thinking, and actually what spurred that thought was this idea of the nap ministry, because as Vani said, things like bubble baths, what I'd rather have in sweltering, like 40-degree heat Sri Lanka is not a bubble bath. I would like a nap. Like I would really like a nap, because that makes so much more sense for the environment that I'm in. But an afternoon nap is seen as a marker now of laziness and, of non-professionalism, and it's seen as, you have your 8-hour day and the most you can do is take this, 1 hour for lunch. That's acceptable, but that's kind of it. And you hear a lot about, South Asians kind of be like, oh, we take so many tea breaks, we take a chai break, yes, because it's good for you to take a break and step away from the work you're doing and regroup. And so all of these acts that we do and we have always done in our communities and in our existences that are actually very healing and very important for us. have been now reframed to us as markers of professionalism, of laziness, of just not fitting into anymore this global north framing of how you need to be and your hustle culture. I mean, I won't get on hustle culture because it's something that makes me very, very annoyed. But it's very interesting to see now also how these other cultures are repackaging what we have already done and then reselling it back to you, right? Like, take a yoga class in your lunch break because it's good for your posture. Okay. So it's very interesting. I think that was something that's very interesting to me, is that I think a lot of the times what we need to do is go back and question why things were done in the way that they were done, and find ways to reintegrate those, because a lot of our, especially in indigenous cultures in particular, a lot of practices that are traditional and inherent, which have been scoffed at and put aside, were actually very healing. And it found ways to weave self-care into our everyday existence, and not as a special act that you stop your regular life for and then go and do. It is ensuring that consistently we are centering our wellness, our health, and our needs at the forefront. I just wanted to say those two things because they came up for me very strongly from everything everyone's been saying so far.
Great, thank you so much. I think, those are excellent points. And I really think this idea, in fact, it's also come up in the chat box, the culture of performance of professionalism. Thanks, Kadeja. I love that phrase, the performance of professionalism, and everything you're saying, around the fact that in many, many places, these are the things people always did anyway. And maybe, again, we have to go back to what we were saying right at the beginning, redefine what we're actually talking about and how we're talking about this whole thing. And I think also the point you made around pleasure. And Vani, I was wondering if you had any additional comments to make about that, because I know that Tarshi's work comes very strongly from this sort of pleasure affirming lens and centering that in the work. So if there's anything you'd like to add at this point.
Yeah, just sort of talking about self-care and the right to well-being as feminist rights. It sort of extends from the difficulty we have had in positioning pleasure as the right for all human beings, not just the people who are in heterosexual relationships, who are cisgender. But as you peel away those layers and you fall outside the norms of society, my right to pleasure is questioned. And when that is questioned, we've seen that there's usually a corresponding question on whether they have the right to self-care and well-being, because the question almost is like, oh, you have to struggle to get your education, or your very identity is threatened by society, so why do you want pleasure and why do you want to focus on well-being at the moment?
Right.
So and when I spoke about unique stressors right at the beginning, through a series of workshops that we've done, especially with human rights defenders, those who work with people from these marginalized communities, it's something like what Carol said at the beginning. It's there's a lot of difficulty. I mean, there are extra sort of layers of marginalization that have been added in terms of their access to well-being, or new stressors that may not be there for someone who, like a woman with a disability, would have a whole other range of factors causing stress than a woman without a disability. And when you add the other layers of caste, the amount of education they have, the economic class they come from, it just gets so much more complicated. So I mean, just the right to like sexual pleasure as also a form of well-being is out of the question for so many, in many cultures, and all the more so if you're marginalized.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and thank you for making it. There's loads of really interesting stuff coming up in the chat box as well. And I don't have the time to read through all of it, but I encourage all of you to read each other's comments. And also we have 10 more minutes before we go over to questions, but please, everyone, remember to put questions into the Q&A box that the panelists will address at the end. I'm just going to go on to the sort of last main question that I had, and that is around what key opportunities and challenges would you identify in terms of driving forward a decolonized approach to wellness and self-care? And I know some of those have come up, but to wellness and self-care specifically in the gender-based violence, in the violence against women, violence against children field. And Carol, I'd like to direct this question to you first, please, if you don't mind.
Sure, thank you, Aisha. I think the key opportunities are one is to address the social determinants of health that are causing these stressors, the issues that are causing sexual gender-based violence, in addressing the perpetrators, in addressing the learned behaviors of perpetrators, learned behaviors of men, patriarchy, things that are contributing negatively to our stress, negatively to our mental health. There's key opportunities to address these things. When we look at environmental factors, even for survivors of sexual gender-based violence, are their needs being met? Are there cases being heard in court? Are the first responders, the police, the social workers, the counselors, are they equipped to provide services that they're needed to provide these survivors with hope? Are the courts ready to process these cases? Do they have the financial means to get back and forth to court, back and forth to the hospital? Is counseling available? Not just the one-off when they come and report, but is there counseling 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 8 weeks, that is evidence-based, that meets their cultural and linguistic needs? These are key opportunities to address what a survivor needs and including them in a process. So including them in a process is really, what do you need to restore your faith, your hope, to reclaim your joy, reclaim your time? Because we can come in, I'm an African woman. I was born in Sierra Leone, currently live in Sierra Leone, but what I get all the time, oh, you always come in with your big English. So we come in with our westernized knowledge, and that doesn't work. In our culture, laughing, singing, dancing, chanting works. But at the same time, after that's over, in the context of survivors of SGBV, they're still sitting with that pain. So how do we help them to learn how to regulate their emotions, how to identify their triggers? There's key opportunities to do a lot of learning around the work that we're doing in terms of our self-care and our wellness, but also for the individuals. As Vani said, we're people who are doing people work. So how do we help those people as well build up their skills?
Absolutely, thank you. Again, would either of the other panelists like to comment on that? Key opportunities, key challenges, moving this forward in our field. And if not, that's totally fine as well, because we can move on. Yeah, Vani, go ahead.
Just a few points. One primarily, I guess, on funding, especially for organizations that work on. There is increasing awareness that we need to, when we fund organizations, we also build in a mental health component to it and so on. But given a lot of funding comes from the West, what is a way that funders can ensure that localized, contextualized practices of well-being are prioritized in this funding, as opposed to saying things like, oh, let's fund therapy for all staff members, which is great, it may work, but for a lot of people, therapy may not be the source of well-being that they want to access. And a lot of times funding priorities also sort of compel organizations to choose ways of to build in components in their program which may not be relevant. Like this one example I heard long ago resonates with me so much. When India has over the last, say, 7, 8 years, prioritized building toilets, to improve sanitation, of course, no questions asked on the importance of it. But in villages, when women would go to the fields to, do their business, that would be this one time that these women would get time away from home. They're going early in the morning, they're going before, the other people in the family start sort of pestering them to get on with the day and do their chores. This was a time of collective yes, I wish it were more hygienic. I wish it would be different, but the building of toilets within the household sort of, reduce that opportunity. So now there are even fewer opportunities for women to be out. There are different ways of course, arguing about the benefits of it and the drawbacks of it. But just to say that when solutions are not coming from the context in which they are meant to operate, these aspects of well-being get left out. So how can funders sort of give space for these solutions to emerge?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Bani.
And if I could.
Kara, yes.
Yeah, so Kelly just put in the chat room saying that it should be non-clinical. And I agree with you, Kelly. Not everything rises to the level that individuals need to see a psychiatrist or a psychiatrist. If we're providing community-based support, strengthening capacity at the community level, so that individuals want to recognize when something's going wrong. In some of our cultures, we're just like, just work, ignore what's happening. Then we're burnt out. Then our stress levels are high. We're unable to manage. But just learning when stress starts knocking at your door, how to stop and address the situation instead of making it a more complex situation where everything's going wrong. You can't handle anything. Someone may say one thing to you, and that just blows everything off, and you're hysterical, and people are like, where is this coming from? Well, it's like a volcano. Stress reacted. It's like a volcano, and it has to go somewhere to go. When it gets to a level, it's going to explode. So really, at the community level, making it non-clinical and empowering individuals that are doing the people work, empowering the frontline responders to respond to individuals. I think that's one of the key opportunities as well. Thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so I think that kind of brings us perfectly actually to the point at which we were going to open the floor for questions from our audience. And at this point, I see there are 2 questions in the Q&A box, and then it's not saying who, so anyone who would like to answer, please. But the question from Neeta is, how may we promote self-care within individuals, communities, and organizations as part of daily life with our young learners within the context of our own cultures and call out colonized methods? So that, and actually the second question is quite related to that as well. How do we de-learn colonized methods that are imposed or not effective within society, as this has been dominant for centuries? So again, I think we've been discussing, around some of this, but would anyone like to deal more specifically with this question?
I'm happy to jump in terms of the de-learning part of it. I think what has been really heartening over the last few years is to see decolonization go from a buzzword that everyone kind of throws in to sound sexy, to really questioning how that gets implemented as a practice. And also, I think the first step for that, and I think really the success of that, and that I hope answers the question also, is that I think the first step is to look inward and really challenge oneself. Because I think often when we are saying we're challenging or we're decolonizing, we're pushing it externally and we're not necessarily looking inward to say, what is it about how I function, frame, speak, and navigate things? Because until you sort of do it yourself, you don't have a template to show others that actually this is how we can switch the narrative or switch the way we do things. The second thing is, I think, and this is sort of antithetical to the conversation in terms of wellness and self-care, but I think it does require some uncomfortable, introspective work on each of our parts and understanding where our systems of privilege as well as our systems of oppression intersect. I think Vani said this in the beginning, but a lot of us who have access to this language, for example, in Sri Lanka, a lot of the conversation on self-care, and there's not a lot, but what is there is extremely available in English, right? In Sinhala and Tamil, there's very, very little. So how do we also, I think that is when it becomes almost irrelevant to people, is because it is not being framed in the most basic way in a language that they speak and understand. And for me, I have seen the second you change the conversation and you're using the vernacular to engage with people on these subjects, or even taking what's already there and finding ways to translate it into the vernacular, I have found to be really important first steps in making it relevant and realistic for people. And of course, people who, and this has been my experience, perhaps I'm wrong, I find there is a condescending way of looking at people who exist in the margins and who are dealing with the yoke of oppression and persecution. We assume that these things are irrelevant. We assume for them that these things are irrelevant to them. Right. We make these judgment calls because, of course, we know better, right? We are educated, we speak English, we function in an international setting. Of course, we know better than they. And then when you sit them down, I have found, I mean, I often say this to people, I have found that more so-called lower class men, for example, working in trade unions, working at the grassroots, they may not agree with feminist approaches, but they get it. Than upper middle class women I have interacted with, right? But we assume that, because they're like these rough and ready, like sort of working class, but they're not going to get it. And of course, they're the ones standing against it. Actually, they get it. They don't. Not all of them agree with it, and some of them don't see it as a priority and whatever. That's separate, but they get it. And I think that is also a part of the approaches we need to take. Is that who are we talking to? How are we talking to them? And are we assuming that this is of no interest to them because we have made those decisions on their behalf instead of asking them whether this is important and even giving them a chance to engage with it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sharanya. Great points. Yeah. And would anyone else like to deal more with the first part around how do we do it with our young learners? How do we promote self-care with younger people within the context of our own cultures? How do we begin to have the conversations, maybe,
I can jump in for a minute. And I think just to back up what Sharanya said, it's a process of unlearning. We've been taught so much. We've been taught how to hold on to pain. We've been taught from our mothers, our grandmothers, to just keep going. And it's really unlearning that and learning how to stop, how to recognize what's causing us pain. And also when we talk about self-care within young learners and even survivors, it's really, what do they need? Young learners, survivors, vulnerable populations is really, someone spoke about it, self-awareness and learning the power of self. Because if we're talking about self-care, what does that look like? What do they need? And with young learners, learning how to identify, process, and regulate their emotions from an early age. Because anger, aggression, perpetrators that commit gender-based violence, these are learned behaviors. So how do we teach them to control their urge, which is an emotion? How do we teach them to control their own stress levels, their sexual urges? Because remember, when we're talking about low to middle income countries, you have situations where you may have family members all sleeping in one bed. And so you have boys and girls that are sleeping with their parents. Parents are having sex in the same bed. So these are learned behaviors that urge develop. So how are we teaching them from an early age how to regulate their emotions? And then also how to have self-compassion. Oftentimes we would beat ourselves up about things that have gone wrong. We'll blame ourselves. And, victim blaming sometimes is internalized as well. We blame ourselves, but how to have that compassion for ourselves. And really, if we're going to change what wellness looks like, decolonization, we have to educate the children from an early age. And that can be done through, through services, but it goes back to funding and availability of services. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, funding and availability of services, of course, but also going back to what, we were saying before and what Sharanya was saying, also remembering the things that automatically were a part of our lives for many of us before we kind of forgot all about it. And then it got reframed as something we had to buy or sign up to, or, have as separate. So it's also interesting. And there's an interesting comment in the chat box also here saying building space for collective joy and celebration can be important, which is something we can all do, right? And I find there's encouragement to take time off without any change in people's workload, which could be impractical, but we need space to build joy and optimism and connections between movement builders. And I'm sure that's equally true for, young people and students and young. Yeah, so that's, very, very interesting discussion. We just have a few minutes left, and I as of now, I don't see any other questions in our Q&A box. I'm just quickly gonna see if there's any other questions in the chat box, and if anyone does have anything else that they'd like to ask, we have a few minutes, but if there isn't anything else, I'm going to, slowly close.
Sorry, Aisha, can I just add something really quickly to what Carol said about what we learned from our mothers and our grandmothers?
Yes.
And I just also wanted to add that there's such a martyrdom attached to burnout, especially for women. I get so frustrated when I listen, particularly younger men who say, oh, my mother woke up at 5 in the morning and she cooked all of our meals. She never sat down. Did you help her though? Or did you just like glorify? There's in Hinduism, we have this idea, which I'm sure Vani is familiar with. It's like the woman has to be like Durga with many arms, and she's doing all of these things. It's very common, like imagery, right? Of her, this goddess with many arms. And I think that is it's such a key example for me of how this is so linked to patriarchy, because it now, I hear so many of my friends saying, now not only can we can have it all, but we're expected to have it all. We have to be this perfect mother, but we also have to have time for our girlfriends, but we also, have to have lovely houses. We have to be working. And now we put this incredible pressure on women to say that if you don't do all of it, you are a failure. And women carry that burden so much, because if you fail, you let down your entire gender. You don't just let down yourself. And I think we need to acknowledge that sort of unfair collective burden that is placed on women, which is so at the root of why their wellness is significantly compromised. I was just thinking of that when Carol said, what do we learn from our mothers and grandmothers? And silent, martyred suffering is, is a lesson I find that is passed down in every culture, regardless of its framings and origins. I just want to add that.
Go ahead, Vani.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Vani.
Thank you. I was just thinking and how closely that is linked to how burnout is defined or seen globally, right? It is seen as an occupational phenomenon, which means it's only something available at a workplace where you're getting a salary. So unpaid labor, the work that women do at home, the work that a caregiver for, say, someone who's ill at home, all of these are just never considered as also possible circumstances where burnout can happen. So there is this patriarchy and marginalization linked in these ways as well.
Absolutely. Great point. Carol, go ahead.
And even in our relationships, how we learn relationships, and how when you look at domestic violence and the cycle, it's like, oh, he just slapped you once, he apologized. His family came and they came bearing gifts, so take him back, which just perpetuates the circle of violence within our intimate partner relationships. And our kids see that. And so our girls are growing up, boys are growing up, oh, it's okay. One of the dominant behaviors that I see within our cultures is that silent treatment. It's emotional abusive. It's emotionally abusive. And so for individuals to say, oh, we live in the same house, we haven't talked for 2 weeks. It's like, huh? So it's been normalized. Our pain has been normalized. The martyrdom has been normalized. So unpacking that, unlearning it, and how do we create boundaries? so that we have healthy and flourishing relationships that work for us. You know, there's a good movie to watch. It's called In Our Mother's Gardens, and it's really looking at the pain that our mothers and grandmothers have endured and how we've learned that. And so I think the onus is on us to unlearn and for us to teach our children healthier ways, so that 50 years from now, they're not having these discussions on how do we take care of ourselves? How do we practice wellness? It's already ingrained in them. These are behaviors that they're growing up with. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really something amazing to hope for, and I think a great note to end on. And thank you so much, Carol, and thank you, Vani, Sharanya, for this really amazing, very vibrant discussion. Very grateful to all three of you and to our brilliant audience, actually, with all the different points that they've made as well. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm gonna hand this back to Anik to close the session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Carol, Vani, Sharanya, and Aisha, for a fantastic conversation. And thank you so much to all of the participants. It was so lively in the chat. It makes me feel like I wish we could all be in the same room, which in September, there is going to be this fantastic opportunity for us all to be in the same room together. And I really do hope that many of you will be able to make it to the forum. There are going to be multiple events and discussions around self and collective care. There are also going to be multiple opportunities, events and discussions around decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing approaches, and really trying to unpack this and thinking about what it means in different parts of our work. So I really do hope that you'll be able to be there and join in those conversations. But as you know, these are long-standing areas of commitment for SVRI. So the conversations are certainly not going to stop here, nor are they going to stop after the forum. And we hope that everybody will continue to engage in those. So thank you all so much. There's so much to think about. And honestly, it's such a big topic. It's really difficult to cover. I mean, that this time just flew by. So thank you again, everyone. And we look forward to the continued engagements. Have a good afternoon, evening, day, wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Yay! Well done, everyone. That's really awesome.